It is a pleasure to be back in the saddle as we tackle one of the most glaring examples of the double standard currently rotting the core of our federal justice system. We are looking at a moment in the Senate that perfectly encapsulates the struggle for the very soul of the American rule of law, featuring a clash between Senator Ted Cruz and Cory Booker. This is not just a disagreement over policy or a polite debate between colleagues on the Hill. It is a fundamental battle over whether the law applies to everyone or if it is merely a tool used by the radical left to intimidate their political opponents. When you look at the raw footage of this exchange, you see Ted Cruz doing what he does best, which is holding the mirror up to the face of the establishment and forcing them to look at their own hypocrisy. He starts by zeroing in on the absolute chaos we saw following the Dobbs decision, where the highest court in our land was under literal siege. We are talking about Supreme Court justices, men and women who have dedicated their lives to the Constitution, being harassed in their own neighborhoods while their children slept inside. Now, under federal law, specifically Title 18, Section 1507 of the U.S. Code, it is a clear-cut crime to picket or parade near a judge's residence with the intent to influence a case. This isn't a suggestion and it isn't a guideline, it is a black and white statute designed to protect the independence of the judiciary from mob rule. Yet, as Cruz points out with surgical precision, the Department of Justice under the current administration has treated these laws like they are written in invisible ink. The contrast here is what should make every red-blooded American's blood boil. While the DOJ was busy hunting down grandmothers who walked through the Capitol on January 6, they were nowhere to be found when radical activists were shouting through bullhorns at 2 a.m. in front of Justice Kavanaugh's house. This isn't just a failure of law enforcement, it is a calculated political decision to allow a climate of fear to permeate the lives of our conservative jurists. Senator Cruz isn't just complaining about the noise, he is sounding the alarm on the weaponization of silence. By refusing to prosecute these clear violations of federal law, the Attorney General is essentially sending a green light to the radical base of the Democrat Party. The message is loud and clear: if you don't like a court ruling, go ahead and harass the judges at their homes, because we won't lift a finger to stop you. Then we see Cory Booker step up to the plate, and his performance is exactly what we've come to expect from the modern Democrat Party. He doesn't address the specific failure to prosecute or the blatant disregard for Section 1507. Instead, he retreats into the usual rhetoric of feigned outrage, calling Cruz's factual observations a series of lies. It's the classic play from the leftist handbook, and when you can't win on the facts, you attack the character of the man presenting them. Booker tries to hide behind the fact that there was bipartisan legislation passed for judicial security, as if signing a piece of paper for more cameras and guards somehow erases the fact that the DOJ is refusing to enforce the laws already on the books. It's a shell game. They want to talk about security because it sounds nice, but they refuse to talk about prosecution because that would mean holding their own supporters accountable for their lawless behavior. This is the central theme of the Republican struggle in the modern era, and the fight for equal justice under the law. We are tired of a two-tiered system where your proximity to the leftist agenda determines whether or not the FBI shows up at your door in tactical gear. When Cruz brings up the specific protesters and the specific lack of charges, he is speaking for the millions of Americans who feel like the deck is being stacked against them by their own government. The liberal media will tell you that Booker won this exchange because he sounded passionate, but if you look at the substance, he didn't have a single leg to stand on. Passion is not a substitute for the law. You can shout about dangerous rhetoric all you want, but the reality is that the only people actually being threatened and followed to their homes were the conservative justices. We have to understand the historical context of what is happening here. For decades, the left used the courts as a bypass for the democratic process, legislating from the bench because they knew their radical ideas couldn't win at the ballot box. Now that we finally have a court that respects the original intent of the Constitution and the sovereignty of the states, the left has decided that the court itself is illegitimate. This is why they support nationwide injunctions from activist judges in Hawaii or California who try to shut down the entire country's border policy with a single stroke of a pen. They love the judiciary when it serves as a rubber stamp for the progressive agenda, but the moment it returns power to the people and the states, they are perfectly happy to let the mob take over. The Dobbs decision was a victory for the sanctity of life and for the 10th Amendment, but it also exposed the deep-seated intolerance of the Democrat establishment. They didn't just disagree with the ruling, they encouraged the rage. Remember when Chuck Schumer stood on the steps of the Supreme Court and told Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh that they had released the whirlwind and would pay the price? That is not the language of a statesman, that is the language of an agitator. When a high-ranking Democrat leader uses that kind of rhetoric, it's no wonder that activists feel emboldened to violate federal law. Senator Cruz is absolutely right to demand accountability, because without it, the judicial system becomes nothing more than a hostage of whichever party can scream the loudest and act the most lawlessly. Booker's defense is essentially a massive distraction. He wants to talk about the general climate of political violence, trying to equate the targeted, illegal harassment of Supreme Court justices with the broad political disagreements that have existed since the founding of the Republic. It's an intellectual dishonesty that characterizes the entire woke movement. They want to ignore the specific crimes of the left while magnifying the perceived sins of the right. The reality of the situation is that we are at a crossroads. Either we have a country where the law is applied fairly and without bias, or we have a banana republic where the ruling party protects its foot soldiers while persecuting its enemies. Senator Cruz is standing in the gap, refusing to let the DOJ's dereliction of duty go unnoticed, and that is why the left hates him so much. They hate him because he refuses to play the game. He doesn't accept the premise that we should just move on and forget that the homes of Supreme Court justices were targeted by organized, funded groups. He understands that if you allow the home of a judge to become a battlefield, you have effectively ended the independence of the court. The reason this specific hearing resonated so deeply across the heartland is that it exposed the raw nerves of a fractured nation. You have to look at the body language of Cory Booker during this exchange. He isn't just debating, he is performing. He is leaning into that theatrical indignation that has become the hallmark of the New Jersey senator's career. But while he's busy crafting a viral moment for the evening news, Senator Cruz is busy citing the Federal Register. This is the fundamental difference between the two parties today. One side relies on the emotional manipulation of the masses, while the other is desperately trying to cling to the wreckage of our constitutional norms. Let's talk about the specific failure of the Department of Justice that Cruz was hammering home. When we talk about Attorney General Merrick Garland, we are talking about a man who has shown an incredible amount of energy when it comes to investigating concerned parents at school board meetings. He had no problem mobilizing the vast resources of the federal government to look into moms and dads who were fed up with radical gender ideology and CRT being pushed on their children. But when it comes to a mob of protesters explicitly violating Section 1507 by trying to intimidate Justice Amy Coney Barrett, suddenly the DOJ becomes a paralyzed bureaucracy. The hypocrisy is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Think back to the summer of 2020. We were told that fiery but mostly peaceful protests were the highest form of democracy, even as small businesses were being torched and federal courthouses in Portland were under a nightly siege for months. The message from the Democrat elite was clear: if your cause is social justice, the law is flexible. But if you are a conservative justice who believes that the Constitution actually means what it says, you are on your own. You and your family are fair game for the mob. Senator Booker tries to pivot by saying that Democrats also face threats. Well, of course they do. No sane person on the Republican side of the aisle is advocating for violence or harassment against any public official. But there is a massive difference between a random threat from a lone nutcase and an organized, sustained campaign of harassment that is being ignored by the very people sworn to uphold the law. Booker wants to muddy the waters because he knows that if the American people focus on the specific facts of the Dobbs protests, the Democrats look like the party of lawlessness. What Cruz is doing here is vital because he is protecting the institution of the court itself. If a justice has to look over their shoulder or worry about the safety of their spouse and children every time they write an opinion, we no longer have a judiciary. We have a political body that is susceptible to extortion. The founders designed the Supreme Court to be insulated from the passions of the moment. That is why they have life tenure. They aren't supposed to care what the polls say or what the activists in the street are screaming. But that independence relies on the executive branch doing its job and enforcing the law. When the Biden administration refuses to act, they are effectively joining the protest. Their silence is an endorsement. Their inaction is a weapon. They are telling the radical left, keep doing what you're doing, because it helps our political narrative. It's a cynical and dangerous game, and it's one that could lead to a total breakdown of our civil society. We saw how close it came when a man traveled across the country with a firearm and burglary tools, intending to assassinate Justice Kavanaugh. Did that stop the protests? No. Did it lead to a massive crackdown by the DOJ on the groups organizing these home visits? Absolutely not. Booker's response to this is to call it a lie. It's the ultimate gaslighting technique. We all saw the videos. We saw the groups like Ruth Sent Us posting the addresses of the justices online. We saw the crowds outside the homes. We saw the lack of arrests. To call the reporting of those facts a lie is an insult to the intelligence of every American citizen. It shows a level of contempt for the truth that should disqualify anyone from high office. But in the world of the radical left, the truth is whatever serves the greater good of the party's power. We also need to address the issue of nationwide injunctions that Cruz mentioned. This is another tool in the leftist arsenal to subvert the will of the people. They find one sympathetic judge in a liberal circuit who is willing to issue a ruling that stops a common-sense border policy for the entire country. It's judicial activism at its worst. It allows the minority to bypass the legislative process and the executive branch. This is why the fight over judicial appointments is so fierce. The Democrats aren't looking for judges, they are looking for political operatives in robes. When Senator Cruz stands up and demands that the law be enforced equally, he is fighting for the guy who works 40 hours a week and expects his government to keep the peace. He is fighting for the family that believes in the sanctity of the home. He is fighting for the idea that in America, we settle our differences at the ballot box and in the courtroom, not through intimidation and harassment at a judge's front door. The Democrat response to this has been to try and pack the court. They want to add seats until they have a permanent liberal majority. Why? Because they can't win the argument on the merits. They know that the American people, by and large, do not want open borders, they do not want runaway inflation, and they do not want radical social experiments forced on their kids. Since they can't win through the front door of the legislature, they try to break in through the back door of the judiciary. And when that doesn't work, they turn to the mob. That is the cycle we are seeing. It starts with radical rhetoric from people like Booker and Schumer, it moves to organized harassment in the streets, and it is facilitated by a DOJ that looks the other way. It is a coordinated effort to delegitimize any institution that stands in the way of their power. Senator Cruz is the lone voice in that room actually speaking truth to power, and you can see how much it rattles the establishment. Look at the way Booker tries to claim the mantle of bipartisanship because they passed a security bill. It's a classic Washington, D.C. trick. They pass a bill to fund more bodyguards while they continue to encourage the very behavior that makes those bodyguards necessary. It's like a person who sets a fire and then wants a medal for calling the fire department. If they actually cared about judicial security, they would be demanding that Merrick Garland start filing charges against the people violating Section 1507. But they won't do that, because those people are their base. This isn't just about Ted Cruz versus Cory Booker. This is about the future of the American Republic. Are we going to be a nation of laws, or a nation of men? Are we going to allow the loudest and most violent voices to dictate the direction of our country? Or are we going to stand up and demand that the law be applied fairly to everyone, regardless of their political affiliation? The standoff we are witnessing in that Senate chamber is a microcosm of a much larger, more dangerous shift in the American landscape. It's the transition from a society based on equal justice under law to one based on social justice through intimidation. When you listen to the cadence of the debate, you hear Senator Cruz meticulously laying out the legal groundwork, citing the statutes, and highlighting the specific failures of the executive branch. He is operating in the realm of facts and law. Meanwhile, Senator Booker is operating in the realm of narrative and emotion. This isn't just a difference in style, it's a difference in worldviews. One side believes that the law is a fixed point, a north star that guides us regardless of who is in power. The other side, the side Booker represents, seems to believe that the law is a living, breathing thing that should adapt to the moral arc of the universe, which, coincidentally, always seems to align with the current platform of the Democrat Party. This is why they find it so easy to ignore the harassment of conservative justices. In their minds, those justices are on the wrong side of history, so the laws protecting them are suddenly secondary to the right to protest. But let's be very clear about what these protests actually were. These weren't peaceful gatherings in a public square. These were targeted psychological operations. They were designed to ensure that when Justice Kavanaugh or Justice Alito sat down at their dinner tables, they would hear the screams of the mob outside. It was a message sent directly to their families: we know where you live, we know where your children go to school, and we can make your life a living hell if you don't vote the way we want. In any other context, that would be called extortion. In the context of the radical left, it's called activism. Senator Cruz is right to point out that this sets a terrifying precedent. If we allow this to become the new normal, then the rule of law is effectively dead. What happens when the shoe is on the other foot? What happens when a different group of people decides to surround the home of a liberal justice because they don't like a ruling on the Second Amendment or religious liberty? The Democrats would be screaming for the National Guard to be deployed within minutes. They would be talking about insurrection and threats to our democracy. The hypocrisy isn't just a bug in their system, it is the system. And let's look at the role of the media in all of this. While this exchange was happening, how did the mainstream outlets cover it? They painted Cruz as the aggressor, the partisan firebrand who was attacking his colleague. They completely ignored the substance of his argument regarding Section 1507. They didn't want to talk about the law because the law is inconvenient for their narrative. They would much rather focus on Booker's impassioned defense, because it allows them to frame the story as a moral crusade rather than a legal failure. This brings us to the deeper issue of the deep state and the administrative lawlessness we see coming out of Washington. The Department of Justice is no longer an impartial arbiter of federal law. It has become the enforcement arm of the Democrat Party. Whether it's the targeting of pro-life activists with FACE Act charges while ignoring the firebombing of pregnancy centers, or the pursuit of political opponents while protecting the first family, the pattern is undeniable. Senator Cruz is one of the few people with the courage and the legal mind to call it out to their faces. When Booker mentions dangerous rhetoric, he is trying to deflect from the actual, physical danger that conservative justices faced. He wants to talk about words because he can't defend the actions. He wants to create a false equivalence between a senator's speech on the floor and a mob's illegal actions at a private residence. It's a classic "look over there" tactic. While you're worried about rhetoric, they are busy dismantling the protections that keep our judges safe and our legal system independent. We have to ask ourselves, where does this end? If the DOJ can choose which laws to enforce based on the political leanings of the victim and the perpetrator, then we don't have a republic anymore. We have a regime. We have a system where might makes right and the loudest mob wins. That is the path to national suicide. It's the path that led to the downfall of countless civilizations throughout history. The only thing standing in the way of that collapse is a stubborn adherence to the Constitution and leaders who aren't afraid to demand that it be followed. Senator Cruz isn't just fighting for the safety of 6 Supreme Court justices. He is fighting for the safety of every American who might one day find themselves on the wrong side of the prevailing political wind. He understands that if the law doesn't protect a Supreme Court justice, it certainly won't protect you. He is holding the line for the principle that the home is a sanctuary, that the judiciary must be independent, and that the government must be neutral in its application of justice. The American people are waking up to this reality. They see the double standards. They see the two-tiered system. And they see which side is actually standing up for the principles of the founding. They see a senator from Texas who uses the law as a shield for the innocent, and they see a senator from New Jersey who uses his platform as a stage for political theater. The choice between those two visions for America couldn't be clearer. As we move forward into the next election cycle, this issue of judicial integrity and the rule of law will be front and center. We cannot afford to have a Department of Justice that acts as a partisan hit squad. We cannot afford to have a Senate that ignores the blatant violation of federal statutes. We need a return to the common sense that Cruz is advocating for, a return to a country where the law is the law, and the mob stays on the sidewalk, far away from the homes of our public servants. The legacy of this hearing won't be the soundbites that the liberal media plays on loop. It will be the transcript of a man who refused to back down in the face of blatant gaslighting. It will be the record of a senator who stood up and said, "No, the law still matters." And it will be a reminder to every patriot out there that the fight for our country is happening every single day in those halls of power, and we need warriors who are willing to take the hits and keep speaking the truth. The battle between Cruz and Booker isn't just a clash of personalities, it is a clash of legal philosophies that will determine the stability of this nation for the next century. When Booker claims that Democrats care about judicial security, he is pointing to the fences and manpower. But as any person with an ounce of common sense knows, you can build a wall a mile high, but if the people inside that wall are told they cannot touch the invaders, the wall is useless. That is exactly what has happened to our federal law enforcement. They have been neutered by a political ideology that views the angry activist as a protected class. We need to look at the long-term consequences of this DOJ-sanctioned intimidation. If the message to young, aspiring conservative lawyers and judges is that the government will not protect you if you make a difficult, constitutional decision, then we will see a brain drain from the judiciary. Why would any brilliant legal mind subject their spouse and children to a life of fear and harassment just to serve their country? The left knows this. This is slow-motion court packing. They aren't just adding seats, and they are trying to scare the existing conservative voices out of the room or, at the very least, make them think twice before signing an opinion that might trigger the mob. Senator Cruz's focus on the intent of the law is where he truly corners the opposition. Title 18, Section 1507 isn't just about traffic flow or noise ordinances, it's about the intent to influence. That is the heart of the crime. The groups that organized the marches on Justice Alito's home weren't there to sing carols. They were there to influence a pending case. They said it on their websites. They shouted it from their megaphones. They were attempting to obstruct justice in its most literal form. And yet, the Biden DOJ sits on its hands, terrified of offending the woke base that thrives on this kind of chaos. What Booker calls lies, the American people call video evidence. We live in an age where the elite can no longer hide the truth behind a curated evening news segment. We saw the footage of the protesters. We saw the lack of handcuffs. We saw the police standing by, likely under orders from their political superiors not to intervene. This is the depolicing of America, where the law only applies to those who don't have a high-ranking friend in the Democrat Party. Cruz is holding the mirror up to this corruption, and the reflection is so ugly that Booker has no choice but to try and smash the mirror. This debate also highlights the importance of the upcoming judicial appointments. We are seeing why we need originalist judges who aren't swayed by the whirlwind Chuck Schumer promised. We need judges who have the backbone of a Ted Cruz, men and women who understand that their duty is to the Constitution, not to the approval ratings or the safety of their social standing in the DC cocktail circuit. The Democrats' obsession with lived experience and empathy in judges is just code for bias. They want judges who will empathize with the protester and ignore the law. The Republican vision for the judiciary is simple: a neutral umpire who calls balls and strikes based on the rulebook. The Democrat vision is a social worker in a robe who decides who deserves to win based on a hierarchy of grievance. Senator Cruz is standing there on that Senate floor, effectively saying that the rulebook is being set on fire by the very people who are supposed to be guarding it. And he's right. When you allow a mob to dictate the boundaries of judicial independence, you have surrendered the republic to the law of the jungle. Every patriot watching this exchange should be emboldened. It's easy to feel like the institutions are lost, but seeing a senator use his platform to relentlessly pursue the truth shows that there is still a fight to be had. We cannot allow ourselves to be gaslit into believing that what we saw with our own eyes didn't happen. We saw the intimidation. We saw the DOJ's refusal to prosecute. And we saw the Democrat leadership provide the rhetorical cover for it all. As we close this chapter of the Senate's history, let it be remembered that while one side talked about security in the form of more taxpayer-funded bureaucracy, the other side fought for justice in the form of equal application of the law. Senator Cruz's interrogation of the status quo is a service to the country. It reminds us that freedom isn't just a slogan, it's a condition that requires the constant, vigilant enforcement of the laws that protect us all from the tyranny of the mob. We must continue to demand that our leaders follow the example set by Cruz, stand firm, cite the law, and never, ever let the truth be shouted down by the theatrics of the radical left. The work is far from over. This hearing was just one skirmish in a much larger war for the integrity of our legal system. We must stay engaged, stay informed, and continue to support those who have the courage to stand in the breach. The American people deserve a justice system they can trust, and we won't stop until equal justice under law is once again the reality for every citizen, from the highest court in the land to the smallest town in the heartland.